War and Peas. A not very serious novel. By Mark Dennis. Deepest Lincolnshire. Sometime around 1949-ish.
The traveller, we'll call him Wilbur and then forget all about him, had been on the road for many days and was weary. The route he'd trod these past miles was known to few. You had to be inside the Brotherhood to find it, or be in the Automobile Association perhaps. Surveying the area ahead from the towering hillock, compass in hand, the traveller turned to follow the spinning arrow. It stopped, it pointed. Ahead a distant light shone. Oh good. He was in. Wilbur hadn't expected much more than a nice certificate when he'd graduated at the temple. A bit of something to hang on the kitchen wall to show your mates, while you went about your normal life. But during his graduation ceremony, the master had gone pale when a pigeon had delivered a message. Well, actually it was a dove, a stock dove that had been domesticated. They look very similar to rock pigeons, people often make that mistake, but it was definitely a stock dove. Wilbur had been told there and then, and in great secrecy, that he was being trusted with a genuine honor, for he was being given a mission so important that they hadn't thought of a mysterious name for it yet. He was to take a simple message to the most venerated of all Mushy Pea men, after the master of course. He was to meet the Dalai Lama and give him the message. His life, and that of many more, depended on it. The message was whispered. It was cryptic, it was brief. Soon Wilbur would complete his task, deliver the news to the Dalai and leave it with him. The master had told him that this single thing might be the most important message he'd ever be asked to deliver, so Wilbur had agreed, despite having plans for the weekend and having been to the barber's specially. The destination wasn't what Wilbur had expected, but then he thought on. Subterfuge, blend in, be a part, that way nobody would ever suspect. He walked up the path and rang the bell. Danny boy, always a favorite. The door opened and a tired-looking woman in her late 50s stood there, looked Wilbur up and down and called out. It's for you. Wilbur strongly suspected that she was the mystical Dalai's best bint and blessed with second sight. It started to rain, heavily. On quality hall linoleum, the sound that sandals make is a distinctive noise, a sort of sloop shoosh shoosh, although some folks like to describe it as a sloop shoosh instead. Marching, on linoleum, makes a completely different noise, but few do it. March on linoleum, that is. There was a sloop shoosh shoosh and the door opened a little further. The Dalai stood before Wilbur in all his mystic glory. As a recent graduate of the temple, Wilbur wasn't sure of the etiquette involved in addressing such an esteemed figure. Should he bow, curtsy, or even speak at all? That was the question. Hey up me duck, spoke the venerable figure, breaking the tension and tearing down the walls of convention, bare-handed. Hey up. I've a secret message from you-know-who, said the multilingual Wilbur as he pointed in what he thought was an easterly direction. The Dalai stood on his tiptoes looking behind Wilbur, then gave him the "What are you talking about, lad?" look. The master, Mushy Peas. You know who. A look of realization spread over the wise old features of the Dalai. Right, a message. Go on then, what is it? Wilbur wasn't sure that this was how this was supposed to go. He'd expected the Dalai's residence to be more ethereal for one thing. Bead curtains on the door were not ethereal. He'd also been expecting to be asked hard questions to prove his credentials, and a cup of tea wouldn't go amiss, either. Now this basically genial-looking old fellow was expecting the secret message to be delivered there, on the doorstep of the frankly disappointing palace of the Dalai. Come on lad, I haven't got all night. I've got peas coming to the boil. His mightiness, and greatly venerated keeper of the temple and the sacred oaths and stuff, the master, has a message. Wilbur had made that little introduction up on the spot, it seemed fitting, and the Dalai hadn't stopped him, so perhaps he'd got it right after all. There has been issue. There, it was done, now Wilbur deflated, exhausted. For days the message had been burning in his head and he'd been desperately trying to figure out what it all meant. Again? Bloody hell, I'll have a pint of whatever he is drinking, said the Dalai. It wasn't the response Wilbur had anticipated and the expression on his face said so. Before him the Dalai seemed to be doing mental arithmetic or touching cloth, both expressions are very similar, but only one demands a dash before a follow-through. That'll be the 5th. Right, that is serious, for when 5 there are, the peas hit the fan, or so it is written. Okay, good lad, sorry to not invite you in, things to do. Go back to the temple and tell the master to initiate Plan Omega, he'll know what I mean. Don't linger in Lincolnshire, dirty deeds are afoot. Just over the border is this place, my sisters, she'll look after you. It's only 5 bob a night. The Dalai gave Wilbur a knowing look and the door closed shut. Wilbur looked at the business card that had been thrust into his mitt, handmade and quite twee, with a rose motif. It said Bide we, B&B to the stars. Full English, no pets or foreigners, it sounded quite pleasant. It would be nice to think that Wilbur made it to the B&B, had a lovely breakfast the next day and enjoyed a pleasant hassle-free trip back to the temple. So we will, even if life isn't really like that. Behind the door the Dalai waited until the crunching of the gravel had stopped. The peephole told him that the coast was clear, so he pulled the small leatherette-topped stool from out under the table and made the call. He's just left, seemed a nice lad. Tell me again, why you couldn't just phone? In a back room of the temple, the master looked at the phone with disgust. Such contraptions were taking all the drama out of life, they'd never catch on. There are others out there who would know the story, know the secrets, who would want to know and foil our plans. What did you tell him? Plan Omega. Mount an offensive against non-traditional crisp flavors? Why? First thing I could think of. What are we going to do? They have to be moved, we need to speak to him, they can't stay there for long. I give it a few years, and then, boom. Boom? You think so? That's serious. You don't think folks will have forgotten? Maybe, but can we risk it? I think we need them to split up, scatter the future to the 4 winds, until the prophecy fulfills itself, if that is what this is. Split them up, then carry on as normal. You know how this plays out, we just don't know the result. It was true for it was written that, when 5 as there be, not 4 or 3, the story starts over again. The timeline has gone full circle and fate must be allowed to unravel. The writer of the mystic message obviously had some poetic talent, but had rather lost it at the end. Very well, proceed. 3 years later it was done. The king, who'd taken the news quite well considering, had seen the sense of it and had understood the danger and agreed. The king's issue were duly scattered with good intent and he'd been tied off at the nuts to stop any more. The queen, sadly, had died after being stung by a box jellyfish while swimming off Skegness. Experts, analyzing the tale in later years, threw cold water on this as the cause of death, for while the very deadly box jellyfish is an Antipodean species, there is still a higher probability of them being present off the coast of Lincolnshire than of anyone finding the sea at Skegness, let alone swimming in it. Ergo the queen did not succumb that way. The truth never came out. There is a website though, do your own research, sheeple.
A New Dawn. We start our tale, eventually, in the bustling, cosmopolitan town of Mablethorpe, set on the Gold Coast of East Lindsey, in prehistory, a country in its own right. The year is 1974. Flares are in, the poncho ebbs and flows into fashion, and platform shoes give everyone a lift. The country had gone all decimal just a few years previously, and the people were still rejoicing, unless they sold loose veg.
The early spring sun rose gently over the very distant sea. The tide was technically in, but on the southeast Lincolnshire coast that might not always mean that you catch sight of the sea. The new summer season was on the horizon, and Mick Collins was looking forward to his annual emergence from the penury that was a no tourists to feed winter, and to feeling the clanking of loose change around his groin area once again. It had been a long off-season and the dole only went so far. His landlady, Senganella, was fairly understanding and sometimes let him trade on his rudimentary DIY skills as a partial rent payment, but it was still hard going. Once he'd even offered a sort of time-share of his body in part payment, a lodger with benefits type of thing. When she'd eventually stopped laughing, it was agreed never to explore that particular biological cul-de-sac ever again. Mick thought it a pity really. Senga was still quite fit, apart from the tin leg, and that would only be an issue in any al fresco beach sessions interrupted by an electrical storm. What with herself not being earthed by a copper strap? Mick had given it some serious thought, looked it up in the library and decided that his dad had known the score when advising him on the ladies, and if he and Senga did ever hit the sand together, he'd be fine in an electrical storm if he was wearing rubber somewhere. The anticipation of each new Mushy Pea season was always the same, and Mick just couldn't wait to get stuck in. Mushy Peas had been in his family for at least one generation, and he'd inherited the beat from his father when he, like all before him, was called to the great steam-clad kitchen in the sky. The Collinses' recipe was a closely guarded secret, never committed to paper and only whispered in full to Mick using his father, Mick's, dying breath. As families went, the Collinses had little imagination where names for their eldest were concerned, but had a sharp mind for not having to change the stationery on the company notepaper, just because one of them had sold their last tub of hot mushy peas. So, the male Collins line, stretching back as far as the eye could be bothered to see, were all called Mick. Mick, the current one, had never been present at the pre-cooking ingredients mixing, only his dad did that, and Mick had always assumed that the seasoning that made Mick's mushy peas so popular was a kernel-like blend of herbs and spices, and salt. His dad always referred to it as his special salt, but had never offered anything more by way of an explanation. With his father's passing, Mick had inherited the Green Book, a slim tome that charted the progress of Mick's mushy peas down the years, culminating on what he called the Prodcut. Mick Sr. was an intermittent dyslexic. All the male line of the family were, Mick included. At close of play, each season, highs and lows had been carefully summarized and target notes on possible service improvements appended. Later entries reported on how any improvements had been of benefit and which were best consigned to the steel dustbin of disaster. That special salt had been a fairly recent addition, but the results had, the book said, been spectacular. All of the mushy pea beat was in the book. At the back, in the contacts list, were the names and phone numbers of all of the premises that allowed him to ply his trade, and under special salt was the name Vince Smith. A name not new to Mick. Vince was dodgy, and Mick had been surprised to find that his father had enjoyed a professional relationship with such a profoundly shifty character. In his first summer as sole proprietor, Mick had had trouble convincing the special salt supplier that he was to be trusted, and he'd had to pay over the odds until his rather furtive-looking supplier was satisfied that he was bona fide. But you did what you had to do. They'd never met before, and his dad had slipped away pretty quickly, unable to smooth the way as he'd hoped to. Mick knew that he had a reputation to maintain and customers to keep happier than they ever expected to be after a portion of mushy peas, and he was determined not to let the Pea family down. To say that his visits to the local clubs and pubs around his Mablethorpe beat were popular would not be an exaggeration. He'd always known that the peas were good, of the highest quality in fact. Not that he'd ever tried that many portions, father was very strict about that, but now he had a good idea as to why his customers were so keen, specifically, for their mushy peas, and why his dad had described the punters as being hooked on their peas. It was surely that special salt. What the fudge? It was a good half an hour before he'd recovered his equilibrium enough to read the flyer properly. Millie's mushy peas were coming to Mablethorpe, it said. Millie's bloody mushes, what the hell was that all about? Reading on, his heart pumped loudly, thumping in his ears. Freshly cooked mushy peas, delivered to your door, with our special ingredient, just the way you like them, it said. Just call Millie on her local rate number and she guarantees that your generous portion of the food of the gods would be in your hands in 30 minutes, mint sauce extra. Mick sat on the hall chair in silence, turning the leaflet over and over slowly. It was high-tech, glossy, slick, and showed Millie, a comely lass, in a spotless kitchen with a hefty pan a-boiling. She even had a logo, a flipping logo for mushy peas, a logo, I ask you. Well, two can play at that game. Mick looked at the picture carefully. They'd used the latest Gestetner techniques offering the highest quality, and Millie's monochrome image had Mick squinting, and looking at it from different angles, wondering, did he know her?
Confused? You should be. Find out what happens next in the world of Mick Collins and the Podsters of Mablethorpe by getting the novel War and Peas by Mark Dennis. Available as ebook or paperback from Amazon.